I'm very impressed by all of you who had the stamina to still be here, and very thankful to see some smiling faces. I'm going to tell you about some projects I've been working on with members of the Vision Lab, which I co-direct with Professor Talia Konkel. But before I dive into the studies, I wanted to give you a little bit of framework for how we think about the problem of vision in the lab, which is fairly similar to what you're seeing in so far. So start with an observer and the world that presents an image to the eye of the observer. And that comes in these distinct little local measurements, little brightness values, for example, in this demo. And somehow you go from that to an explicit representation of things and places, and it's meaningful and easy to act upon. That's a hard problem, though. If you think about locally, any bit of information in that image, it's totally ambiguous what's causing that. Is there a bright object here and dim lighting, or a dim object with bright lighting? Which pixels even belong together in this array? And you bring to bear a ton of computational machinery in your brain. A lot of brain real estate is devoted to helping you solve the problems of vision. And in particular, we talk a lot about the role of the ventral stream in object recognition. And in visual neuroscience, they ask questions like, what are the representations like at each stage of processing? What mechanism or algorithms are giving rise to these representations? And what pressures are causing them to be that way in the first place? So we know we can get some clues as to the answers by looking at the kind of response properties of individual units at these different stages. So it starts out with really simple like edge detectors or oriented line detectors in the primary visual cortex. And then as you move forward, you get to progressively more and more complex feature representations, to the point where you might find a unit in the high-level visual system that responds super selectively to faces. Show it anything else, it won't fire. It's got to be a face. If you recognize it as a face, that neuron will fire. So how do you go from these pixels to these high-level interpreted representations? And in our field, there's a lot of excitement over the use of deep neural networks to help us understand that, because with deep nets, for the first time, we have kind of a model system that really captures this sort of hierarchical cascade from simple to more complex features and shows an interesting and exciting alignment with the brain. Now, one of the things about the field of visual neuroscience, in my opinion, maybe I'm wrong, is that there's not as much focus or emphasis on the actual percept that people or animals experience. And I want to make sure that everybody here is on the same page about how weird perception is, actually. It's much less like a camera than you might think. And we can't just think of early vision as just somehow passing a copy of the image to the rest of the brain for object recognition. So what do you see here? I'm guessing you see white chess pieces up above and black chess pieces down below. Yeah, fair? No debate, no way. Of course, they're identical, okay? The chess pieces on top are exactly the same pixels as the chess pieces down below, and it'd be hard for me to convince you of that because that's not what you're seeing. I can erase the context that's making you misperceive it, though. Now you can see identical. Those bits on top are the same as the pixels down below. Put the context back, and all of a sudden you're seeing black and white again. So even whether you see a surface as black or white is not determined by the luminance of the pixels coming into your eye. It's black now. So here's another example. Shows a similar illusion. You're probably seeing the surface up above as a darker gray and the one down below as a lighter gray or white even. That's being driven entirely by some pixels on the margin between the two. And in our sort of intro classes, we talk about this is your visual system being super clever. Okay, you've got light coming from above. Your visual system knows light always comes from above. You've got a bright light on a surface here giving you a certain amount of light bouncing towards your eye. And this surface down below is getting incident light. It's not getting as much light, and yet the same 30 candelas is coming at your eye. The only thing that makes sense is the surface below is a bright one in dim lighting, and the one above is a dark one in bright lighting. And this is referred to as kind of your visual system solving the inverse graphics problem, where the image itself is ambiguous and your visual system's decomposing it into sort of atmospheric causes and the surface intrinsic properties of the surfaces themselves. Okay, so what you're seeing isn't in any way a direct reflection of exactly what's out there. Your visual system gathers all this sense data, processes it according to some rules that are built into the system, and make these kind of smart guesstimates about what's out there. And you see the constructed output, not something that was directly measured. I just want to show you a couple more examples that whatever those rules are that your visual system are using, they're kind of weird. So are you all seeing like these blue wireframes as slightly 3D? That little ball is going to bounce into them and change their color. That's it. That's all it's going to change. And for me, it completely squashes them. What's your visual system doing? Why does it care if it's orange or blue? And then when it's blue, it's 3D in a wireframe, and otherwise it's flat. Okay. Okay, there might be a good reason for that, but we're not going to go into it. Even your perception of face identity is in some sense constructed, or definitely constructed, and according to weird rules. And the rules are weird, and we know they're weird because right now this probably doesn't look too strange to you, but if I flip it over, you'll notice that there's something bizarre happening. So your face perception stitches features together, but it doesn't work when the face is upside down. So you're not noticing it. It seems normal when they're upside down. Your prototypes are far from direct measurements of what's going on in the world. It's some sort of construct, and it's got these strict rules that it obeys that in vision science, we call it the system cognitively impenetrable. It doesn't matter if I explain those rules to you. It doesn't matter that you know they're illusions. You can't overpower them. You can't see those things differently. So how can we use deep neural network models to understand something like this? I'm going to tell you about the approach that we use in our lab and just contrast it with kind of another approach that you'll see represented in the field. That one approach is, I'll call it engineered alignment. It's when you're trying to use the deep neural network model as a literal model of the brain. And so you're looking for direct correspondences between components in the model and components of the brain. And if you find a mismatch, you might just inject the computation or the mechanism that you're interested in into the model to increase the alignment. And I'm not placing a judgment about that. I'm just saying this is one approach, one way to make use of these models. An alternative approach is to actually treat the models more like a model organism. It's a mini intelligence that you've trained with some constraints, and you could put it into the batch of all the other model organisms that we use in the field to try to learn abstract sort of answers to problems about, questions about how vision works. And so just to contrast, if I thought there was a certain kind of feature computation missing from the models, I wouldn't necessarily build it directly in, but I might make it possible for the model to learn that representation if it was useful, and then try to understand when does that representation emerge and when doesn't it. The burden for making the model biologically plausible is way high over here and way low over here, right? Because you just have to have something that's interesting and performant and that you can scrutinize to learn something. So I'm going to tell you a project that Srijani Saha has been working on, trying to understand these lightness illusions. These disks are identical. And how it is that your visual system gives rise to these kind of strange misperceptions of lightness. And for this, we know something that about the visual system that suggests the following. So you get an image, it comes into the eye. You have these center surround receptive fields in your eye, these retinal ganglion cells, and they only respond to contrast edges, changes from light to dark, or from red to green, or from blue to yellow, which means the neural image that gets transmitted from your eye is really just this very sparse response to changes in brightness or changes in color. It's not a complete image, and yet at the end of the day, somewhere along the line, you don't see just a bunch of weird edges right now. You see these complete intact surfaces. So your brain must be going from these edge responses to an intact, complete image. And some lightness illusions almost surely rely on this mechanism to some extent. So this is called the corn sweet illusion. Are you seeing the left is gray and the dark gray and the right light is lighter gray? That's being driven entirely by like a little sliver of pixel differences right here. If I cover them up, they look the same. So your system's like measuring those brightness differences at the edge and then somehow just spreading them. throughout the rest of the surface. But these illusions, people think definitely, strongly believe that they cannot rely on the same kinds of edge-based mechanisms. And instead, the theories have proposed that your visual system actually decomposes the image into layered representations, one for the atmosphere, one for the intrinsic properties of the object. And the interpretation that makes sense would be if there was a light circle underneath a dark haze here and a dark circle underneath a light haze there. And this is in line with that kind of inverse graphics idea. Maybe your visual system is trying to pull apart the different causes of the image, the atmosphere and the object itself. And they had good evidence for that idea. So what we're going to do is build a model that does edge-based reconstruction and see how far it gets us. And the naive expectation that we had going into the project is it's going to be able to do things like the corn sweet illusion, but not the more complicated illusions that require a decomposition of the scene. So how do we do this? We take an image, we simulate that contrast response that your retina would have to the image, pass it into a U-Net, and have it reconstruct the original image. And we just use a direct pixel loss. Because remember, our goal here is just to train a model that's competent at this task. And do that with a bunch of ImageNet images, and lo and behold, you'll end up with a system that's pretty good at reconstructing from this edge-based representation a pretty good copy of the original. Now we have our competent little agent that we trained. What would happen if we probed it with visual illusions like we do with like we did with people? So we take the corn sweet illusion. Remember, this is the one that we think almost certainly the model is going to have errors that reflect the human perceptual effect. So take this original image, you get the edge response, pass it into the U-Net. First of all, this is just showing that the brightness values here and here are identical for that. But what the model does, and you can't tell because your visual system has illusions, it paints the side that you misperceive as darker, it actually paints it a little bit darker. And the side you misperceive as lighter, it paints it a little bit lighter. So we thought this would happen because the corn sweet illusion is definitely driven by edge responses, and this model is relying heavily on those edge representations. But what happens when we show the moon illusion? And again, inside these disks, the pixels are identical. There's no brightness difference in actuality there. But the model paints the bottom one darker, the bottom disk darker than the one on the right on the border. So even though in theory this would be the hardest case for the model to capture, we're seeing that this edge-based reconstruction computation is giving rise to errors that are systematically in the direction of the human brightness illusions. We won't have time to go into all these other cases that the model also captures, but there's many of them, and a lot of them also there's whole papers arguing that solving the problem in the way the human visual system does requires some elaborate representation and decomposition into a structured scene representation. It's not perfect. It doesn't match every illusion that we've tested, and I won't also go into great detail on this one, but just to point out, there is a case here where people see a homogeneous gray, but the model thinks the right is a bit darker than the left, and there's other errors that the model makes. And so I think possibly here we're looking at an example where the model is kind of introducing new edges, but your visual system doesn't do that when it fills in. It only smoothly interpolates, something we can test. Point is, though, we have this model which was trained to do something we know the human visual system has to do, go from edge responses to a completed surface representation. We didn't train the model necessarily to do it in any biologically feasible way. I mean, we used a pixel loss to make the model capable of doing it. But this model nevertheless shows a lot of the same effects or errors that recapitulate the illusions that we see in people. And one other quick note, if you have another kind of U-Net model, a denoising U-Net, where you add noise on top of the image and then it has to reconstruct the original, it doesn't show any hint of these same systematic biases. So it's really the filling in from the edges that seems to give rise to the illusions that we see in people. So what does this tell us about our visual systems? So the first point is that these kinds of lightness illusions, which have been held up as a good example of the biological visual system doing something like inverse graphics, trying to separate light source from intrinsic properties of objects and giving you some sort of complete picture of the things that are causing the image. Some people really like that view. I like that view. All of my lectures for any perception class I ever gave started with, this is your vision. Your visual system's smart. It decomposes the scene in the following ways. So if you wanted to hold on to the classic view, one way to do it is think, well, maybe it's not explicitly decompose the scene. Maybe this reconstruction task itself makes the visual system do that. So maybe if we could dig into the internals of the UNet, it's effectively decomposing the scene into separate representations of light source and atmosphere, and the intrinsic properties of the objects in the scene. It's possible. Maybe a simpler idea, though, is that maybe this is it. Maybe the objective is the visual system gets this sparse input from the eye, and it's got to fill in the missing details. Maybe there's like a hint that it fills in the missing details and maybe even boosts the local contrast differences. So it kind of exaggerates differences between adjacent regions. And if that's the case, if that's really what's going on here, then you can think of all of the benefits of this system, which are like lightness constancy, something looking the same in different lighting conditions or different viewing conditions. That's just emerging due to this necessity to reconstruct the image from the edges. And the errors in that system tend to produce helpful side effects like these constancies. Okay, so I want to pause for a beat and say something about Mars 3 levels. And the reason I want to do that is we've heard it mentioned a few times during these sessions so far. And I just want to sort of make sure we're on the same page about these ideas. They come from cognitive science or vision science. David Marr was a vision scientist. He wrote a book called Vision. Makes sense. But it's super influential in the field of cognitive science. And when you hear people talk about these levels, this is what they're referring to. And so Marr's point was that you can think about a problem at these different levels of analysis. You can think about what's the goal of the system? What does it need to accomplish? What is the exact algorithm that's being used to accomplish that goal? The use of the term algorithm is different than I hear in machine learning a lot, which seems to be talking about the learning algorithm. This is talking more about the representations and the operations over the intermediate representations on the way to some final output. And then finally, physically, how's that instantiated? And so the reason I'm bringing this up is I think that the sort of version of NeuroAI where you look for the emergence of behaviors and representations in systems rather than building them in gives you some opportunities to look at the computational goals of the system. And there's been some neat work on this over the years. So this is Surya Ganguly's best paper, if you haven't read it. Okay, I'm not qualified to judge most of them. So these are all papers about the computational goals at different levels of the system. And we saw a nice paper yesterday on manifold capacity and so on. And so one of the interesting things is if you look at these papers, they're all talking about how this huge swath of the brain is affected by pressures that I think you can describe as more or less unique or specific to the visual system. The visual system has to solve its own little problems at the different stages, and different things have to be done. And those representations could often be understood really without appeal to other systems. Okay, but it's connected to those other systems ultimately, and you need your visual system to interact with the rest of your cognitive system. And so even though I think it's important to consider what are the sort of unique pressures on the visual system that shape the way the visual system does its work, we also have to think about how ultimately you interface that visual apparatus, the whole thing, with the rest of the cognitive system. So where do the agent's goals come into the picture? What about multimodal representations, et cetera? And if you're thinking primarily about feed-forward connections, it could be a little confusing if that's all you're thinking about. But as many of you know, but probably not everybody, there's a ton of feedback within the visual system. And in the biological visual system, there's just as many axons running backwards through the system as there is running forwards, 50-50. What's all that backwards connectivity for? Let's think about it. So this is a paper I did with Talia Konkel with a sort of biologically inspired implementation of feedback connections within deep neural network models for the purpose specifically of allowing the goals of the system to steer the encoding in the visual system in a way that was inspired by some neuroscience work. So a lot of the deep neural network models we study or use in our research are purely feed-forward models. And of course, this kind of model isn't going to be able to capture any of the phenomena that are due to feedback in the biological visual system. A lot of people have noted that and done work addressing that limitation of the deep neural network models. And some of them that we looked into weren't really appropriate for this kind of goal-directed encoding idea that we had. And others were kind of rigid in their implementation in ways that made it hard to work with. And also, a lot of these systems suffered from rampant hallucinations, which I'll address as we go. So none of these solutions work for us. So two things that we wanted to capture from the literature on how feedback connections affect visual processing, how downstream areas affect the early visual responses. And the first one was this optogenetics paper, which specifically showed that the feedback connections have a modulatory impact. So they don't really, they don't inject activations into the earlier layers, but if there is activations there, they can ramp them up or down. It's a cool optogenetics study. And then there's another study, a series of studies that showed if you kind of focus your attention on a goal, like I'm going to pay attention to all the faces in the room right now, there's no such thing as tuning your attention to faces right here only, faces in this part of my visual field. If I want to pay attention to these faces, I'm paying attention to any face in the visual field. All faces get boosted throughout the visual field. So it's like the full field broadcasting of your attention. So we wanted to build some of these features into a nice little AlexNet model, or LRM AlexNet. And so in order to accomplish that, we added feedback connections. So we've got standard feed-forward convolutional neural network, and we added connections from higher layers down to earlier layers. Once you add feedback in, you have to make a decision about how you want to handle time. And we did the simplest thing you could possibly do. We're going to do 2 passes of information through the system. The first pass is going to be a normal feed-forward pass. An image comes in, it gets processed by each layer, you get an output representation, and at that point, you've set up a bunch of possible feedback signals. You pass the image through a second time, and at each step of the way, you do the same original processing that you would do for the normal feed-forward pass, but now there's feedback signals that could potentially modulate it. And the way that we implemented this was first, we used this multiplicative motif. So take the original feed-forward response, take the feed-forward response multiplied by the feedback, and that is your new updated representation on the modulated pass. So critically, if there's no feedback, then of course there's no change to this. If there's no input signal, then the feedback alone won't do anything. So 0 times the feedback equals 0. So it's not injecting a signal, it's just ramping responses up and down. Okay, and then the next thing we did was, if you're going to take a source layer of feedback and influence an earlier target layer, how should each channel of the source layer influence each channel of the target layer? And we just made this a fully connected matrix here, and those weights are learned. We didn't hand design in any way the connections between them. Okay, and then the last thing we did that I think is important is we made sure that the representation on the initial forward pass was useful for the task, as was the modulated one. So basically, the model couldn't Just the second modulated pass is the only one that had to be good for the task. And the task in this one was simply just ImageNet classification, but could be any task. Okay, so our hope was that this modulatory motif would prevent hallucinations in the model. This is our implementation of broadcasting over space. And note that there's nothing about attentional feedback per se in here. This is just a model that needs to learn to do its primary task, and it happens to have feedback connections. They're not being used in any specific way. They're not special weights in this architecture at this point. But our hope is that this will learn connections that are useful for cognitive steering, which I'll tell you about in a moment. So first, how well does this model do on its primary task? And the answer is it does fairly well. AlexNets get like 57% correct on ImageNet classification. The LRM version does just as well. And if anything, it does better on its second pass. So it somehow learned more useful features. In the interest of time, I'm not going to say too much about that. The quality of the representations was fine. It could do the task still. But what we were hoping is that now we have an interface where we can take goals, a goal representation of some kind, and use it to modify the early responses of the model. So here's the basic idea. We have the output space of the model we can think of as a space in which we could instantiate different goals as a vector in that space. So just use a specific example here. If you have this image with multiple things that you could be paying attention to, and the target was the key, then if you have a representation of what the key output would look like, then you can use that as the feedback vector. And that could be used to modulate the input to steer it towards the representation of key. And that will only work if there's evidence for key in the image, in theory at least. And then maybe your target at the moment is the cat, and you want to boost the response to the cat, then that vector could be fed back and used to modulate the forward pass. So now we have this interface where all we need is some representation of the target in this output vector space, and then we can see how it impacts the early responses and the final output of the model. And we set up these kind of composite image challenges where there's two answers to a classification problem. Models can't do it because they're only allowed to give one, and they always give the wrong one anyway. For these, you could present them overlapping like this or side by side, doesn't matter. And we tried different steering vectors. We could use the output vector, just the one hot code for the actual answer for the category of the image. We could use the exact vector that would be elicited by one of the images, say the dog, or we could use what we call the category prototype, which is the average response in the output vector for the target category. What we found was that yes, you could steer the model to pull out the information of the target category, and it worked best when we used the category prototype, which is there. And importantly, we're not just injecting dog information into the network, which you don't have to do for ImageNet trained models anyway, but no, we're not just injecting that signal, because look, when it's not present in the image, tuning your attention to dogs doesn't lead to a dog output. So there's very minimal false alarms with this setup. And I'll say one more thing about this, which is it's kind of neat that the category prototype was the most effective way to tune the system towards the target, even more effective than tuning it towards the exact representation of one of the items. And that led us to test whether or not we could take a label and map the word representation into the output space of the LRM model and use that as the steering vector. So we can give verbal instructions to the model. And that works almost as well as the category prototype. So this gives us a really flexible way of taking high-level representations, interfacing them with this visual system, and then deeply affecting how it's processing the incoming information in ways that seems to connect with what we've seen in some nice cognitive work by Lupian and Ward, for example. Wrapping up. So how do these other systems interface with vision? How do your goals come into the picture? We already knew that it's got to be about these long-range modulatory connections. But what we learned from this study was that the nature of those feedback connections could be built. Those weights can be learned just in the service, the normal within vision modular do vision tasks kind of framework. You don't have to have a special extra objective of be good at steering. You can just have those feedbacks be learned in the service of visual representation learning, and then the system can be kind of hijacked in order to enable this attentional control that we see. And I didn't have time to dig down into some of the nuts and bolts of the model, but we see a lot of emergent alignment between the internals of this LRM model and biological visual systems. For example, extraclassical receptive fields emerge in early layers. Okay, so wrapping up then, for us, for our lab, putting together the minimal architecture that you need to get, almost complete, semi-complete little artificial agent. And I would argue or suggest that we need at least 5 of these kind of modules that we study in the field. I think we need an early perceptual system for obvious reasons. And we have this high-level visual system. Bless you. We need spatial attention, which I didn't talk about today. Works a little bit different than feature-based attention, or a lot different. I would say you need long-term memory. I'm going out on a limb here. And you need a working memory system. And I think with just these 5 components, we can do a lot. I think we could build a little agent and have it live in its little visual world. It can learn with mostly modular within region rules. And if we wire it up, we don't have to structure these wires. We can have the mapping between systems and be learned in the service of the primary kind of tasks for each of these areas. And any fans of 80s sci-fi, I'm going to call this the Johnny Five architecture until somebody makes me stop. Johnny Five, he was the first AI in movies. He wasn't very good. I think if we build this and put it into a photorealistic environment, we'll see the emergence of a lot of the neural signatures and behavioral signatures that we're interested in. And so that's kind of, for us, the big next thing. So thank you all for your attention, and thanks the group. Your questions?
The amazing talk.
Thank you.
I have a question about the modulatory paths, kind of echoing yesterday's talk.
Yeah.
So one another obvious choice in dealing with the time dimension is you just iterate over until the neuromodulatory path kind of converges to some type of low energy minima point, right?
Yeah.
So do you suspect that if you change the loss target from the 2-pass iteration modulated target to the converged target, then do you think the network will do better on the ImageNet task?
Yeah, it's a good question. So we didn't vary the number of iterations we trained on. We only ever did the 2, but we did iterate past the number we trained on. So what happens if we crank this to 3 or 4 or 5? And it's very quickly saturates in terms of the returns. Arguably better with 3, but not noticeably better with 4. So yeah, so it's a pretty quick time resolution, 2 beats, and it seemed to saturate almost. Yeah.
Great, thanks for the talk. Let's see, how do you imagine building access vision into your agent?
Yes.
I move Fovea, kind of, the visual search, that kind of stuff.
That guy over there. Yeah, great question. We have a project we call SACADNet, and Nick Blausch in the lab has been working on that. So one of the key characteristics of biological vision is you have high resolution color vision in the fovea and low resolution, less colorful vision in the periphery, and how do we integrate that into the encoder, and what role does it play in, say, self-supervised learning or the objectives of the model? So we think it should be in there. It's actually an engineering problem as much as anything, because sampling images in a realistic way is non-trivial. But Nick hasn't, I think, made some real progress on that. So, but yeah, we think it should be a foveated visual system so that there's incentive to visually explore. Right? It's a natural way of building that in. And we also think it's important for there to be connectivity between the eye movement control centers and the early visual areas, and that signal could be really important for the self-supervised learning and tuning up of the system. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Hi, thanks for the great talk.
Thank you.
I'm just trying to understand the role of language in the steering process.
Mm-hmm.
So from what you presented, there's no real benefit from language itself, right? If you just have your prototype, or if you had another kind of label, like a circle that you mapped onto like a dog or something, just some other abstract label, it seems like it would be the same effect, right? There's nothing special about language from what you showed. While like in reality for the human studies, right, like language is very convenient. These are labels that we use day to day, so it's easy to test in experiments. But yeah, I'm just curious about the evidence. Yeah.
For us, the value of it would be like, ultimately, if I wanted to give an arbitrary task to a model that I trained, if I didn't have to change anything and I could just give it new instructions the way we do with our human subjects, come into the lab, here's your verbal instructions, now do something. That's the way we were seeing it as being interesting. But we just did it as a proof of concept, like, because the prototype is effective, it doesn't have to be as precise as the sort of input visual representations are. It can be a coarse representation coming from vision and still effectively sort of guide visual encoding. So the actual goal there was just to show that the abstractness that comes from language isn't a problem for this steering mechanism. It's actually going to work just fine.
Very, very beautiful talk.
Thank you.
I have a philosophical question. Sorry about this. So you contrasted the sort of just use edges as input view with the inverse graphics view.
Yeah.
But it seems to me these are sort of operating at different levels of explanation. So the edges as input thing is sort of like a computational goal level explanation, and the inverse graphics thing is a more algorithmic level explanation. I was just curious, do you think this intuition is reasonable? And more broadly, is there any hope for this inverse graphics kind of view of vision?
Right. Yeah, it's a good question. I see them both as, at least as they're presented in the field, as they're presented as computational goals of the system. And the sort of Bayesian vision camp really embraces the inverse graphics idea the most, I think. And so I wouldn't say that our one little study kind of overthrows that tradition, because they've shown pretty clearly that the visual system does some smart integration of like conflicting cues, and it's doing a lot more sophisticated than just this edge-based reconstruction. So I see the edge-based reconstruction as giving you the starting point. You have to have your complete picture before you start to reason and think on top of it. So I think if the inverse graphics part comes in, it's not the way you get to the surface depiction, but what you do with it is still parcelate into separate components and reason separately about the surface properties of the object and the lighting conditions. But you don't need it to get the depicted view. I think the depicted view can come from the sort of primitive mechanism.
Very nice talk. I wanted to ask a question about the first part, the goal of vision.
Mm-hmm.
Were there scenarios where the training distribution that you used for reconstruction, when you tested the model didn't show the kind of biases that you would see in humans? And what does that say about sort of the statistics that kind of led us to have this kind of biases?
Yeah. So the short answer is the statistics of the distribution did seem to matter in that you could train multiple models with different data sets, and they're kind of variable in how big the illusion would be for one image or another. In ways that at first we thought this is going to be a way of gaining insight into the role of the statistics in forming the images, and then it just seemed a little misbehaved. And so we just trained a lot of models on a lot of different image sets to show that what we're seeing here is fairly general. So I like the question. It turns out it might be complicated, and I might have to have clearer ideas about how the statistics are varying and maybe independent measures of that, rather than just maybe sampling, which is what we did. Now.
Very interesting talk. So, yeah, the idea that reconstructing image from edge image is very interesting. But as following up John's point, I think what's shared between the brain and ANN might not be the goals, but mechanism could be shared. So I'm very curious whether you have tried to pull out some mechanisms that is creating this kind of illusion in the network.
Yeah, it's a good question. We haven't done it yet, and the reason is that my initial intuition was that we should make it more biologically plausible first, because after all, we were training on pixel level loss, and so we were trying to think of ways to sort of close the loop and have the system solve the reconstruction problem without ever knowing what the pixel loss was. And to be honest, we just haven't done that yet. First of all, I think that's going to be really hard. We kind of feel like bootstrap your own generator. It's got to build stuck on that. I think if we get a system that works that way, then I'll be more sort of optimistic that the internal mechanisms might align or be informative of how the biological system actually does it. Thanks.
Beautiful talk. I was still thinking about the first part of the talk, and can you comment on or speculate about like various perceptions? So, for example, we kind of interpret the output of the UNet as like the perceived scenes, and where do you think that thing is, like V1 or something? And the other related question is like, you train it by reconstructing the pixel intensity, and that's just not in your series, kind of not accessible to the cortex directly.
Right.
Do you think, how does that work in the brain?
Yeah, so it's a good question. I think that we don't know, and the reason we don't know, I think, is because ultimately, what must be the case is that there's a set of neurons whose activations tell you about brightness values at locations in the visual field. And like, if you're seeing a gray square here, it's because there's a little population of cells that encode for luminance values at those positions, and they're active right now at that level. So there must be, right? There must be a population of cells whose activations tells you that that's there. And to the extent that that's been measured in primate models, the initial representation is tethered to the true luminance, and then there's a beat, and then a moment later it seems to reflect the perceived luminance. So there are neurons in the early visual cortex whose activations correspond to the percept. But we have to make that more concrete, I think.
All right, let's